In the final session of today's program, we're going to put our reading glasses on. So if you got them, put them on, because we're going to dive into our book talk of the year. It's properly themed for what we're seeing around the world and what we've discussed today, particularly around the relationship between business and government. So, without further ado, please join in me in welcoming our fireside chat with Brodie Mullins, author of The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government, along with moderator Jamie Lai, partner at Cooley.
Fabulous. We do recognize that we are the only thing standing between you and cocktails, so we'll try to be both entertaining and efficient. It's, as you all know, if you've been here before, my favorite part of the conference, because I get to pretend that I'm Oprah Winfrey for 35 minutes. And this year, no one made me do a book about the end of human existence. So while we are talking about greed, corruption, and power, it's, we're not quite at the end of the world by the time we get to the end of your book.
Not far away. But.
Yeah. So Brodie, please introduce yourself and set the stage. Give us a hook into your book.
Yeah, so my name is Brodie Mullins. I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. I worked for the Wall Street Journal for 20 years, covering sort of the intersection of business and government, as in looking at how companies and businesses try to get what they want in D.C. Most reporters in D.C. cover what happens in the House or Senate floor, the big votes or White House tweets or proclamations, and I kind of look behind the scenes to figure out why those things are happening, what companies are trying to do, how lobbyists are using their money to make presidents and Congress do things. So I covered lobbying for about 20 years, mainly with the Wall Street Journal, and then in 2015, I heard about a prominent up-and-coming young lobbyist from a company around here, actually, who was found dead on a golf course. And as a reporter, anytime someone on your beat winds up dead on a golf course, you think this might be a story. So I started looking into him. He was a young lobbyist for Genentech, and he had been with the company for 10 or 15 years. He'd made a ton of money. He was a big mover and shaker in Democratic politics in D.C. When I started looking into him, I realized that, at the Wall Street Journal, just because someone's dead doesn't mean it's a story for us. I need to figure out if there was something bigger or a scandal or there's some, trend or something like that. So I started calling around, and I found out that he made a ton of money. He owned many expensive toys, including a $300,000 mahogany wood boat. He owned a condo at Millennium Tower right down the street here, where his neighbors were Joe Montana and Hunter Pence. And I figured if you're writing a book about lobbying that you can get Joe Montana into it, that's a pretty good start. So then I looked into this $300,000 mahogany boat that he owned, and I found out that there's only one company in the country that makes mahogany wood boats. It's a Hackercraft company, so I called them up, and they said, I was trying to sort of subtly figure out information about this guy, and the president of the company who answered the phone kind of sniffed me out pretty quickly, and he said, why is the Wall Street Journal calling about this? I'm not going to talk to you. When the FBI called me, I gave him everything I had, and he hung up on me. And I was like, holy, the FBI's calling, then there's a scandal here. So it turns out that this guy, Evan Morris, the lobbyist at Genentech, his sort of rise in D.C., how he became so powerful, and then how he ended up dead on a golf course, turned out to be a sort of great narrative for how lobbying has changed in D.C., how companies have gained power in D.C. So I sort of used him as the main character for a book that's about some pretty weighty topics, corporate power, lobbying, campaign finance, but we try to tell the story through the mystery of what happened to this guy and a bunch of other lobbyists who were really prominent in Washington along the way.
So is it bad form if I read to you from your own book? Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay. From 1967 to 2007, the number of registered lobbyists in Washington, the vast majority of whom represented business interests, exploded from some 5 or 6 dozen to nearly 15,000. By 2012, for every $1 spent by consumer groups or environmental activists to influence federal policy, corporations and their allies were spending 86. Quote, "My job used to be booze, broads, and golf," remarked one lobbyist in 1979. Now it's ongoing coalitions and keeping information flowing, God forbid. That was my editorial. So talk to us a little bit, and I'll give my own totally perhaps superfluous remarks about kind of the way that you unfold the story in the book. But even for somebody who must pay attention to politics for a living in M&A, I was amazed at this sort of flow change from the early 70s to today. So how do you help us really orient, a more authentic understanding of the shift in lobbying over this era that you cover in the book?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try to do it efficiently. So we write it really about how companies and corporate America came to power in DC, and companies did not have much power in DC before the 1970s. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I sort of thought, I remember when I was a kid in high school and college, you learn about the Standard Oils and the AT&Ts and the Rockefellers and that days of heavy market concentration, in the early 1900s. And I sort of thought, well, companies are powerful now, they must have been powerful all the way in between. And something I didn't know about, which we write about a lot, is how after the big trust era, there was the antitrust era. And from the New Deal to the Great Society, the government grew and grew and grew, all sorts of new regulations, departments, agencies, and whatnot, and companies had actually very little influence. Quick aside, barely remember Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader was the most influential person in government in the 1970s. He took on big industries like the auto industry and like GM and beat them in the 1970s, which shows that how much power consumer groups and Ralph Nader had and how little influence big companies had. So that all changed in the 1970s when companies decided to invest in DC to try to push back on the growth of the government. Another anecdote here is that you said that the number of lobbyists rose from the 1970s to whatever time that was, from a small number of lobbyists to 15,000. What I find also interesting, and it's actually more relevant here today, I think, is that in 2007, the last time the government reformed the lobbying laws, there were 13,000 registered lobbyists in 2007, or maybe it was 15,000 in 2007. Today, there's 13,000. So according to the lobbying rules, there are fewer lobbyists in DC today than there were in 2007. And what that means is that, not that there are fewer lobbyists, it means that lobbyists are just no longer registering as lobbyists. And that's kind of what happened with our friend Evan Morris here, is that what we write about is how lobbying has changed. It's moved from sort of a relationship game, campaign checks, the smoke-filled room that we used to hear about, the backroom deals that used to be lobbying, to now lobbying is more working outside of DC, working with, trying to get voters to support various public policy matters. Evan Morris played in that world, and that lobbying that takes place, or influence that takes place outside of DC, is not considered lobbying. So a lot of lobbying has moved from lobbying to sort of influencing constituents outside of DC. What that means is that as the influence industry has grown, most of the money flowing in that world is going to unregulated ways. So to bring it back to Evan Morris, I got a hold of Evan Morris's lobbying budget at Genentech. He spent every year $50 million lobbying DC, just one company. Of that, $5 million was disclosed as lobbying spending. The other $45 million he spent as he pleased. And what reporters normally say in DC is that lack of disclosure means the government doesn't know about the spending, the reporters don't know, and the public doesn't know. In this case, for Evan Morris and for Genentech, his company didn't know. His company was not watching how he was spending this money, so he ended up creating a fake lobbying campaign, starting a kickback operation with another lobbyist, and when he got caught is how he ended up dead on the golf course with a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
So let's peel the layers back a little bit on lobbying, because I think he sets a colorful tone through the book. And if I would just plug your book for a second, it may not sound like what you want to read right before you go to bed, but it's actually a fascinating, incredibly beautifully written, very well-researched book. And for those of us who do not have 6 luxurious hours to read in a row any single day, it is also very easy to pick up a little bit at a time. So I think the vignettes and the sort of the stories of Washington, that if you didn't grow up there, you really do remember the pieces of the news flash, as you sort of chart your own professional path. I think it was a very cool read and interesting to better understand. You wrote it with your brother too, which maybe you'll talk to us a little bit about during the cocktail reception. I don't know if I could write a book with any of my family members.
Cocktails are a better way of talking about that.
So let's talk a little bit about, as we focus on sort of today's corporate governance landscape, what more do we need to understand about either the evolution of lobbying or the way that it has come into present day? What is this, an offensive game? Is this a defensive game? What do we need to understand it as sort of alive corporate citizens?
So I mentioned that I have covered or did cover lobbying for 20 years at the Wall Street Journal, and when I first started covering the industry, I sort of thought that the way lobbying works is the FDA or the EPA makes some regulation, and companies and industries hire lobbyists to go to DC to try to block the regulation or water it down. And increasingly over time, I realized that lobbying is more of an offensive game, as you just sort of alluded to, that companies send lobbyists to DC to create rules and regulations or to shift regulations coming out of DC in ways that don't hurt their client as much, their company as much, but hurt competitors, or hurt other industries. I mean, most of the big tech fights in DC are, TikTok going against Facebook and Facebook going against Google and Google going against Oracle, or all in reverse order. And they're all trying to use DC to create advantages for themselves, which really shouldn't be how the marketplace works. But the fact is that that is how it works. So much of lobbying is one industry against another industry. In DC, we call it company-on-company violence, where the whole game is just try to use DC to change the rules of the marketplace to get an advantage.
And what do we think about, we, particularly on the West Coast, we spend a lot of our time not just with big, massive companies who have billions of dollars of market cap or of influence without, CEOs who are really happy to go toe-to-toe with their peers. How do you think about the role of lobbying or the importance of the lobbying component in the way that we evolve our technologies, whether that's crypto or AI or whatever comes next? What do we need to understand about what that landscape is? Can you just hall pass lobbying?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, and I think most of our book is critical of the lobbying industry and certainly of the lobbyists who we write about, who are all getting these huge scandals. However, one of the things we sort of land on is that a key to a successful business, rightly or wrongly, in this country today is to have a good operation in DC. At least so you're following what's going on and knowing what rules and regulations are coming out so you can stay ahead of them, and maybe more so to be able to use your influence in DC to change regulations that hurt that help your company at the expense of others, of competitors. At the same time, a lot of what we write about is big companies and the Chamber of Commerce and the big tech companies and the bigger Wall Street firms. A lot of the other firms feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. They don't have the money and resources to go to DC and to fight these fights, and they end up losing. And we see that on tech. Interesting, I saw the other day that one of the things that Mark Andreessen is doing with the companies that he funds, the smaller companies he funds, is he creates a lobbying and public relations arm for them. And I think that indicates that people know that even these smaller companies that don't have the resources need to have a Washington presence or a lobbying operation sort of defending their interests. Otherwise, they're going to get gobbled up or snuffed out by larger competitors. Yeah. So lobbying is really, again, rightly or wrongly, part of doing business these days.
Will you indulge me to read from your book again? This, for those of you who remembered the 90s, in August of 1998, Bill Gates was deposed by government prosecutors at Microsoft's headquarters in Redmond, Washington. Over 3 days of questioning in a company boardroom, the software magnate was by turns haughty, combative, slippery, and aloof. During fits of squirms, I love that word, if you've ever watched him, and evasion, Gates claimed repeatedly not to recall events at issue in the lawsuit, and he haggled over the meanings of words such as we, compete, and concerned. One of the Justice Department's top prosecutors in the case told a reporter, quote, "There's an exchange between Gates and David Boies on the second day where David showed him an email which came from Bill G. at Microsoft, which was his handle. David said something like, 'Did you write this?' Bill said no. So David asked, 'Where'd this come from?' Gates said, 'A computer.'" And I mean, that's clearly not an acceptable MO going forward, but I think this, that wasn't that long ago, right? 1998 really wasn't that long ago when you had this whole sector of the economy basically choosing to its own peril. For those of you that don't remember that part of the Microsoft story, you can read about it here. But, and he was a target, right? And he and Larry had their multi-stage spat going on in the public view. But I do think it's really interesting for us, particularly as counselors or people who are in boardrooms or with execs thinking about these cutting edge technologies or drugs. I think you have a good drug story you want to share with us. But it's interesting to think about sort of how do we use the tools of the last 40, 50 years to better understand that this is not, we can't be a Bill G at Microsoft,
Right.
And sort of continue to pave the way for where we think we're headed, because regulation is inevitable in
Right.
many of these areas.
Or antitrust enforcement in his case. So I mean, that was a great example that we used in the book to sort of show, one, how Google actually got so powerful and how the rest of the tech industry grew in DC. And actually, this goes back to a little bit of your last question, that in the 1990s, Microsoft and Bill Gates were the smartest companies and engineers, smartest company and engineers in the country. They were doing fantastic things out here, and they did not want Washington in their way, and therefore they didn't invest in Washington and lobbyists and antitrust lawyers, and really they didn't have any eyes and ears in DC. So when in 1998 the Clinton administration or their Justice Department filed a big antitrust lawsuit against them, I think with also 34 states or something like that, Microsoft was caught flat-footed. And they spent the next 10 years essentially entangled in this antitrust fight in Washington, which they won, but did they lose? And the point is that they had to devote resources and time and effort to focusing on Washington. Someone told me this the other day that at the exact same time, Google was coming up. And we're all obviously Googling. We could have been Binging
or Netscaping.
Or Netscaping, right? But Google sort of saw this opening to jump into DC at a time when Microsoft was distracted. Our story is really more about Google. Google saw what happened to Microsoft and realized we want to be the biggest, baddest company in the world, and we're not going to make that mistake. So they immediately hired lobbyists in DC, Republicans and Democrats, hired a big antitrust staff also to kind of keep tabs on DC so they weren't caught flat-footed. And then sure enough, in 2010, when the Federal Trade Commission launched a big antitrust investigation into Google was able to block it because they had friends and they'd done a lot of work and they had sort of created a friendly environment in DC. And that 2012 antitrust investigation that ended in 2012 that Google stopped is the same one that Jonathan Cantor brought, or maybe Donald Trump brought, that they won this summer. So Google essentially delayed that antitrust loss, for a decade.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting to watch the personalities at play here too. I mean, one of the most interesting parts of the book is the character development. I don't know if that's appropriate to commend you for in nonfiction, but I do think that piece of it is very interesting, that you are talking about repeat players here who are shifting themselves regardless of parties sometimes, and kind of replaying the same game over and over, which is, I'm very curious to see how that will play out in the future administration in terms of whether or not any of that historical learning is replayable. Are we just sort of, changing names and faces here, or are we actually changing the game? I'm curious, as I was reading this, you can't help but read with a 2024 lens. Mm-hmm. What do you think the role of sort of social media or mass available content is as we go forward with respect to lobbying influence? Yeah,
I mean, it's really changing Washington. I mean, one of the things that we write about is that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, lobbying used to be a relationship game in DC. You hired a fat cat lobbyist who had connections to the few members of Congress or government officials who really controlled power in DC, and you could block things or get things passed or get favors. That doesn't work anymore, in part because after Watergate, we sort of changed the way government power is held in DC. Government power used to be held largely by the president and by a few people in Congress, the House, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. After Watergate, we spread power all over around Congress in Washington. So there's more than 100 committee or subcommittee chairs or ranking members on Capitol Hill. All sorts of people have their hands in policymaking, therefore you need tons of lobbyists to get things done. That's sort of one step in the evolution. The next step in the evolution of lobbying is members of Congress know, in the entire time I've been in DC, the one thing I know for sure is that members of Congress exist to get reelected. And to get reelected, you need money, but really you need 51% of your constituents. And lobbyists know this. So what lobbyists often do now is, instead of trying to get a sweetheart deal from a member, which is hard to get, is you go out to his or her constituents in their district And if you can get 51% of a member of Congress's constituents to support a trade bill or an immigration policy or a small business tax credit or whatever, the member of Congress is going to follow. And that gets to your social media question. Social media is an incredibly powerful tool to get to those constituents because I don't understand this as a member of the mainstream media, but people believe what they read on the internet, and people believe these ads, and they believe these social media posts and Twitter, and it's a really good way of getting to people and getting them fired up for or against some policy position. So the internet and social media is really becoming a powerful tool. And Donald Trump is just as good as Barack Obama at using that.
So the idea that maybe people are having better access to content undermining some of that power, you feel like actually it's just a tool that is now
absolutely.
at the hands of.
It's not undermining, it's just a tool. It's moving the lobbying from the registered disclosed lobbyists we talked about, those 15,000 people, to the hundreds of thousands of people who are operating these campaigns in the public affairs space on behalf of companies.
I do think it's interesting to go back to the Microsoft anecdote, many of you probably remember that a huge turning point in that whole saga was going through garbage of Microsoft. And I just think no one would bother going through anybody's garbage today, right? They're just trying to figure out what he or she is doing online in any particular space as the first mode of investigation. Let's shift to antitrust. Obviously, a large component piece of what we're talking today is how regulation overall is going to impact the go-forward deal making, market dynamics, the corporate boardroom, C-suite dynamics, and I think more than ever, our boardrooms and our C-suites feel pulled in many, many, many different directions at once. And one of the ways we obviously counsel from an M&A perspective is around antitrust dynamics. Which way is the pendulum swinging? What are peers doing? Where is investigation energy being placed? And I would be very curious to sort of hear how you think the pro-business alliance undoing is going over the past particular sort of last 3-5 years-ish will play forward regardless of regardless of an administration change, but how is that going to layer over that?
So this is my favorite topic in DC right now. Antitrust for my entire life was an incredibly boring word, and now all of a sudden it's the most exciting thing going on in DC. And to your question, what's going to happen? No one knows. We can read some tea leaves. But you can make an argument that for the sort of Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor, anti-Borkian, pro-Brandeisian form of antitrust, that Donald Trump might be better than Kamala Harris. The people who were at the Justice Department and at the FTC were worried about Kamala Harris. Is she going to undermine them? She has very strong ties to some of these bigger tech companies out here. So they were worried about her. They don't love Donald Trump, but Donald Trump says the right things. He did start the first Google antitrust investigation under Bill Barr late in his term. We sat down with J.D. Vance well before he was important, when he was just a U.S. Senator. And he said to me that concentrated economic power is as bad or worse than government power. And this is a Republican who's now the vice president, about to be the vice president. And in my lifetime, that's not how Republicans talk. If I was talking to Elizabeth Warren, yes, that's what Elizabeth Warren says, but not Republicans. And it's not just J.D. Vance. It's Josh Hawley, the Republican from Missouri. It's Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee has been talking about blocking this merger of Kroger's and Albertsons that she's been on the lead on. She's also going after Ticketmaster, and the list sort of goes on and on of Republicans who are all of a sudden sort of acting like anti-business Democrats. And a lot of those people just took power. I mean, Marco Rubio is one. Marco Rubio is a Republican who, I don't know where he is on antitrust, but for years he was a solid, mainstream Ronald Reagan conservative. And then he sort of switched and become much more populist. I mean, he was in favor of allowing Amazon in his state workers at Amazon to join unions, which again is a totally fine idea for Elizabeth Warren, not for Marco Rubio. Now Marco Rubio's, Secretary of State, or about to be. So a lot of these populist Republicans are gaining power and then getting key positions in the administration. Now, to your question, what happens with antitrust? We don't know. My guess is that Trump does not try to slow down or roll back the the two Google cases. I think it's one too late, and I think he personally, lots of Republicans just hate Google. So I think they let those go. Do they continue the rigorous antitrust enforcement? They certainly could. The problem with making a prediction is that Donald Trump is a victim of his most recent conversations so often, and I could certainly see him having a conversation with a bunch of bankers or having a big banker be his Treasury Secretary, and those people are going to say to him, if you really want to get the economy going, take off the shackles. And he could very easily listen to that, and then everything changes again. But I think overall, there's still, for the first time in 50 years, this movement toward stronger antitrust enforcement across the board.
And how do you see, we've talked a lot about tech and probably maybe the early underpinnings of tech, but do you have an anecdote on the pharma or life sciences side that you think is a good nugget for us to take away sort of some of the intersection between regulation and lobbying?
So there's two pharma examples. One is that until tech came along, pharma was the most powerful lobby in DC. When we were researching this book, I went back and found that there were hearings involving Senator John Kennedy in the 1950s, holding hearings on drug prices in DC, and that's when the effort to stop the exorbitant, cost of drug prices. That's when that effort began. And only last year did Biden successfully roll back the prices of just a handful of drugs. So I think that we see pharma's influence beginning to decline, sort of the same time that some of these other companies are starting to see their influence decline as these Republicans and Democrats sort of come together and go after companies. The other example, can I go back to my Evan Morris example with, we talked about how lobbying has changed from what we call the inside game of the sweetheart deal to the outside game of using constituents. And one of the examples along the way that we use to sort of illustrate this change is Evan Morris, the Genentech lobbyist. In 2007, I believe, do you remember hearing about the avian bird flu overseas? There were, I think, a few dozen or maybe just a handful of people who died overseas of the avian bird flu. Evan Morris at the time, before he worked for Genentech, was working for Roche, which was had invested in Genentech at the time. Roche is a big Swiss pharmaceutical company. They make scores of drugs, one of the oldest pharmaceutical companies in the country. They make Tamiflu, among other things. Anyway, in 2007, Evan Morris saw these news stories about the avian bird flu, and he went out and hired media consultants to go promote stories and actually write stories in conservative blogs or liberal blogs. So trying with the goal of having Americans worry about the avian bird flu and it was going to come to the U.S., it was going to kill all these people. All of a sudden, constituents around the country started writing and calling their members of Congress and saying, hey, the avian bird flu is going to come to the U.S., like what are we doing about it? In November, or I think it's October 2007, 32 Senate Democrats wrote a letter to the Bush administration saying, hey, the avian bird flu is coming. We should create a stockpile of treatments for the avian bird flu. The Bush administration said we should. By the way, those senators included Senator Hillary Clinton, Senator Barack Obama, and Senator Joe Biden. So these were like big-time, Democrats who were writing to Bush. Bush agreed. Congress allocated $2 billion to create a stockpile of avian bird flu medications. As soon as that was created, Congress said, okay, how are we going to fill this stockpile? And then Evan Morris came back and said, oh, my company Roche makes the only treatment for the avian bird flu, Tamiflu. And so the government bought $2 billion worth of Tamiflu, and obviously the bird flu never came here. And I bet if we go to DC right now and we could find some closet in some bureaucratic office with 2 billion vials of, Anyway, that's a sad story, but that's kind of how lobbying has changed. Members of Congress reflect the interests and worries of their constituents, and so much of lobbying is moving to, therefore, get constituents to press their members of Congress.
I hope we don't ever need those stockpiles, but those are big numbers. That's a big stockpile. I think, and sort of one of the things that stood out to me in your book is you are talking about very large increments of people, of persuasion, of dollars, of stockpiled drugs. I mean, we are not moving in small increments, and it's so interesting to me that I think very few of us, even people who read the Wall Street Journal, there's no like lobbying column, right? And it would just be so interesting if there was a lobby, like sort of like this on the sports page, right? It's like you get the prediction.
Yeah.
I wish there was a lobbying column
Yeah.
to bring a lot of this whole layer of activity more visibly to the surface, or at least to be something that people think about when they are being fed more content. Like, where is this really
Right.
originating,
Right.
or what is behind all of this sudden influx of bird flu propaganda,
Yeah.
right? There's this whole layer that I think what's so it's understandable to me how in the 70s we didn't quite understand what was moving in such large waves.
Right.
And it's almost, by the time you get to the end of your book, you almost think, wow, I see even less than maybe I could have seen for myself in, the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, and as a member of the media, I feel like we have to blame the media. I mean, we as an industry focus on things that matter less or are cheaper. Presidential tweets and bills that have just become law, or votes in the House and Senate floor. It's harder to invest in trying to peel back the curtain on who's behind things. I mean, my best example is the Washington Post, which covers Washington, D.C., and in Washington, D.C., all we do, our hometown industry, is making rules and regulations and laws, and the influence industry is where all the money is, and the Washington Post does not have a reporter who covers the influence industry. It's sort of like Detroit not having an auto reporter. It doesn't make any sense to me. But as a result, all sorts of companies, including Evan Morse and all the people who write about, could get away with all the things they were doing because no one was shining a spotlight on them.
So people talk to you a lot at Washington cocktail parties now, or you don't get invited anymore? How's that working for you?
I think that people are happy that I wrote the book and it's not about them. So
it's like a few moment when they.
So
get to
we
the end.
write it. We have 5 main characters plus Google, and 2 of the characters are dead, and the other 3 wouldn't talk to us. So everyone else will talk to me. Once they know the book's not about them, they're very happy to talk to me. So.
And talk a little bit as we sort of wrap here about what advice you would give to those of us who sit in the boardrooms on the advisory side with management teams trying to do great breakout things. How do you see sort of the culmination of so much work and research informing, if you were at that cocktail party, what would you say to that board?
So the book is obviously meant to inform the public about how industry and lobbying is working. But for this conversation, there's great lessons. One is investments in Washington make sense. I mean, back to Evan Morse again. He had every year he would write a return on investment statement back to Genentech. This year you gave me $50 million and I gave you $2 billion. That makes sense. Now he wasn't scoring that much every year, but lobbyists in DC know that for the amount of money that they're getting, they're making huge gains, not just in government contracts, but also in, blocking or changing other policies that could cost the company money. So one piece of advice is that the amount of money that companies are spending in DC is worth it, is justified, it should probably be increased. The other is people need to watch that money and how that money is spent, particularly in the case of Evan Morse. We're so far from Washington, D.C. DC's so removed, it's easy to just think, well, those guys will figure it out. But there's a ton of money flowing around in D.C. A lot of it is not disclosed, not regulated, and there's a lot of funny business. You hire someone to do a poll, and they come back and say, oh, 51% of people think this. Well, did they do the poll? Did they talk to these people? We have no idea. People are doing social media ads. How much it actually costs to get out there? I think there's a lot of people in DC who know they can sort of pad their margins because no one is watching how these industries or how they create these ads or do these polls or lobbying, for example. People are paid a lot of money because they have a relationship with Senator so-and-so. But do they ever talk to Senator so-and-so? Just because someone used to work for Senator so-and-so doesn't mean that they're connected to them. But of course, when they come to clients, they'll say, oh yeah, pay me $10,000, $20,000 a month because I know Senator so-and-so. But that doesn't mean they're doing anything. There's so much, there's very little accountability in DC. So all that money that's being spent in DC, it can really be at risk sometimes, at risk for fraud.
Anything that you didn't get to write about or leads to your next book or article?
So my next book, I really want to be about antitrust because this topic is amazing. And for 50 years, we we viewed antitrust in one way, and now all of a sudden we're changing, and we don't know where that's going to go. I think that's very interesting. I think that's going to be the single most important economic decision that our country makes in the next 10 or 15 years is where do we go? But another thing that we didn't get into was, this is a very long book, and we tried to follow these 5 really interesting characters and their rises and falls, and therefore there's a bunch of really great stories we ran into that we just that didn't fit with one of our characters. And one of those is that we found out there's a lobbying tactic called intercepts. An intercept is when a lobbying firm or an influence firm is trying to get to a senator or an important member of Congress on some issue, and they hire people almost like actors, but they're more like people who live in the person's district or know the member of Congress to try to get a member of Congress's friends or people they go to church with or Little League spectators to kind of come up to them in a way that seems really organic. To be like, oh, have you noticed that like these tariffs are really hurting my business? Or, this like the grocery store bills are outrageous. And they're all, completely paid for. But for a member of Congress, it looks like, their constituents talking to them, and they're really sensitive to what their constituents think. So the best example we found, or maybe worst example we found, was a company who had tracked down all the people who played in a bridge game with a member of Congress's wife, and like went to all them and sort of influenced them to try to get them to pressure the wife on some trade bill, over a bridge game. Anyway, that was the worst example we saw.
Well, if you need a lawyer to help you on your next research project, you just let me know. I'm fascinated to see what the first year of 25 brings from a deal-making perspective. I've always sort of kept my thoughts to myself that I don't actually think that the last 4 years of antitrust regulation really did turn down the volume on the bigger deals that people wanted to do. I think we live in an environment where people have baked in risk tolerance, and going up against a regulator is just one part of many component pieces to risk tolerance assessments. So I don't think I get to live with that sort of overarching theme going forward, because my personal view is we're just going to see a lot more volatility and a lot of choices to investigate or peel back or criticize that are not always consistent across industries or geographies or products or technology. So we will have more to do maybe from an advisory perspective in the coming years, but deal volume will, by definition, if you've been paying attention today at all, I think we all anticipate we'll be doing more. So we hope we get to see you again and hear your views on how things have panned out, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks.